Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is the Judy Leigh Allen Mexico Center podcast from the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. The asymmetries of the U.S. Mexico border region are a serious obstacle to comparative research and analysis. These are the words of James Gerber and Eduardo Mendoza in a chapter they co-authored on data collection and distribution in the United States and Mexico. In this chapter, which appears in the edited volume by National Commons, they argue that differences in how and why data is collected, as well as the geopolitical units at which data is aggregated, pose challenges to understanding economic and social integration in the border region. I called James Gerber and Eduardo Mendoza to talk about what data is currently available to study the U.S. Mexico border, the challenges in making comparisons between subnational units across the border, and their recommendations for future data collection efforts. James Gerber is Professor Emeritus of Economics at San Diego State University. He is the author of International Economics and numerous works on U.S.-Mexico economic relations, including 50 Years of Change on the U.S.-Mexico border, Growth, Development, and Quality of Life. Eduardo Mendoza is professor in the Department of Economic Studies at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte. He also teaches in the Department of Economics at San Diego State University and has published articles on the economic impacts of U.S.-Mexico economic integration on the Mexican economy. Here's our conversation. James Gerber, Professor Emeritus of Economics at San Diego State University, and Eduardo Mendoza, Professor in the Department of Economic Studies at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, thank you for accepting the invitation to be on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
So today we're talking about something essential to understanding the U.S.-Mexico border, data. You co-authored a chapter titled Data for U.S.-Mexico Border Studies, a comparison of U.S. and Mexican data collection and distribution, which appears in the book by National Commons. You write that there are some important challenges in regards to what data is available to conduct research on the border region. But first, for those who may not be familiar with what kinds of data you might need, and we're talking here about quantitative analysis, to make comparisons across not just different regions within a country, but different regions across the border. So what are some key characteristics of high-quality data that you would want in order to make this research?
I think there are three characteristics of the data that you want. You want it to be obtained based upon similar concepts, both in Mexico and in the United States. That is, the idea of what we're trying to measure is comparable. Secondly, you have to have a methodology for gathering the data, which is it doesn't have to be exactly the same. So, for example, there may be cases in Mexico where people do surveys house to house, whereas that may be a telephone survey in the United States. But the methods of gathering the data have to be relatively similar. And then thirdly, the level of aggregation has to be the same. So you don't want to compare, say, the state of Tamaulipas with the city of or the metropolitan statistical area of Brownsville, Harlingen. I mean, you need to have a similar sort of unit, political boundary, if you will, of analysis. So it could be at the household level if it's very, very fine data, or it could be more aggregated at the level of municipalities, municipios in Mexico, or more or less equivalent to counties in the United States in terms of their the regions they cover. So I think those things are the three key ideas that you have to cover. There oftentimes are seemingly similar sounding concepts, which actually, when you look into them, they're different in the United States and in Mexico. So, that you want to make sure that you really are trying to measure the similar thing. So for example of the latter would be like the concept of unemployment, which is pretty similar actually between the United States and Mexico, but there are some differences which lead to different numbers. And then obviously you're measuring unemployment in the U.S. Versus measuring it in Mexico. Those are two completely different institutional context. So Mexico has a large informal market, and if you are officially unemployed, you can step into the informal market relatively easily, and then you're going to be categorized both in Mexico and in the U.S. as employed. But our informal market is much smaller, and so it's a little bit more difficult depending upon your skills, et cetera. It's a little bit more difficult to enter and leave the informal labor market. More difficult in the U.S. than it is in Mexico. So we have unemployment rates in both places, kind of similar, but then there's this different institutional context, which makes it not as directly comparable as we would like.
So with these requirements in mind, how does existing data help scholars study the border region, and where does it present some challenges more specifically? Because both countries collect at least some demographic data and some economic data at quite granular levels, and have institutions that collect and distribute high quality data, right? Like, so in the U.S., you have the U.S. Census Bureau, and you have the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, or INEGI, in Mexico. So I'm wondering, like, sometimes one realizes, sometimes it's really hard to get data from countries, but in Mexico it seems like there's a lot of data that is available. So I'm wondering, given the presence of high quality data, where do the challenges begin to study the border region?
Let me say that we have, as Jim mentioned, comparable problems. We have methodologies which are a little bit different, aggregation, and those things are basically problems that reflect the lack of coordination between institutions. So that's a problem. And in the case of Mexico, the lack of information too, as mentioned, Jim was mentioning about on regional data. We don't have in Mexico enough regional data. We have some surveys, like the income and expenditure survey, that is not complete. It doesn't cover the whole country. At least it's not representative in terms of statistics. So that is a problem. And another thing that I was mentioning is the lack of coordination, because, I mean, if you think we have NAFTA and then we have the USMCA, and still we don't have coordinated data for trade between Mexico and the United States, right? So how is that possible? Right? So we're talking about a lot of years of trading, intense trading. It's really important in the world, and still we have problems of different ways to measure it. In Mexico, they have exports to United States at the state level, but it's just Mexico to United States at the state level. It's not the Mexican states. So we don't know what the states of Mexico are exporting to the United States, right? So that's a problem. And then on the other hand, we have the Bureau of Transportation and Statistics. They have some kind of good measurement of exports by a state of the United States to states of Mexico. You can do that. But it's in a different classification. It's a harmonized system. And the one that Mexico uses is the North American classification, right? System, industrial classification system. So we have these kind of problems in terms of coordination. I think that's very important. And I don't know, something that has to be addressed eventually, because otherwise we don't know exactly how the things are going on. And that's one example, right? We have several of those.
And Enrique, if you think about it, I mean, why would you want data? Well, I think one of the most interesting and important questions to ask is how integrated are communities along the border? I mean, how, and there's actually a big debate about this. I mean, some people just think, well, that's a crazy question because they're just so integrated, but others say, well, no. I mean, how can they be integrated when conditions are so different and wages are so different and incomes are so different, So you've got this debate on the degree of integration, and because we don't understand that, we can't really talk as completely as we would like about how does the border work? I mean, what's going on in the border? We've got these enormous flows of people that go back and forth on a regular basis, but how does that what does that mean for our economies? What does that mean for our societies? And we can't really there's so many questions there that we'd like to know the answer to that we just don't have the data for to be able to answer, other than we count people crossing, and there we only count people coming into the U.S. from Mexico. We don't really count people going out from the U.S. So, presumably if you go out, you come back at some point.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? Now I'm thinking. It just came to mind. So I'm originally from Mexicali, and so I used to go to school in Colegio on the other side of the border, and so I know that area very well, and the experiences of like going and seeing all these people crossing, back and forth all the time, and with the pandemic and people not being able to cross as freely, I wonder about the impacts that it has. But then how do we get the data? Right. So now I see like maybe this would be like a good way to study the impact that this that border crossing has on towns on both sides of the border. But I guess it's hard to know if there's no data to really study it.
I mean, the case you just cited, living in Mexicali and going to school in Colegio. So there are tens of thousands of students in the San Diego, Tijuana area where I live, for example, that cross, or that may have some years of schooling in Tijuana, some years of schooling in San Diego, and then maybe back to Tijuana or vice versa, And this is a big challenge for schools and educators, and we don't know much about these students, who they are, what their educational needs are. I mean, it's dealt with at the school level and sort of in the individual school level, and it would be nice to understand that population better.
Right, and you also mentioned the people who work on
because of work. Bunch of commuters that you don't know exactly the number. Those are approximations, and if we're talking about integration, as Jim is mentioning, then and you need to measure also all the people, Americans living in Mexico. We have also approximations of how many people Americans live in Mexico, which numbers goes from hundreds of thousands to millions, and we don't know exactly how many. So that's also very important. In the chapter also is mentioned the problem with foreign direct investment, right? Which is also not coordinated. And in the case of the U.S., at least for me, has been hard to find the data. Not what United States is sending abroad, but what exactly foreign direct investment is going in United States, is going to United States. Let's say Mexican investors, Bimbo, or I don't know, those companies, how to measure that. So that's not very clear, and would be another indicator of integration, right?
Can we go back to I'm sorry for interrupting. The issue you raise, Eduardo, about workers, I think is really interesting. There's a number of dimensions to that. And I'm just wondering if you personally have seen research on the numbers, because I was looking for numbers on that recently, and there's some estimates. But if you look at the estimates, maybe roughly the estimates seem to range around 70,000 people commute from Mexico into the U.S. on a regular basis. Okay, that's across the whole border, 70,000. But if you take what is implied by surveys of who crosses the border, why are you crossing? So there are these surveys that are done. COLEF has done a bunch of these where they ask people, why are you crossing to the U.S. or why are you coming into Mexico? What's your main purpose? Visit family, visit friends, go to work. What is it? The numbers, the percentages implied by people that are working is way more than 70,000 if you extrapolate, across the border. So then you think, well, okay, so why isn't there some consistency or congruency between these surveys of who's crossing the border and then other estimates that are put together in different ways of who's crossing the border to work? They don't seem to match up at all. And this is an area where, the U.S. government, should have a statistical program to try to figure this out, And then there's a smaller flow, but important, of people, that cross from the U.S. into Mexico as well. And we don't know what that is.
And that's a problem, because that's the way we can measure what is the level of integration of two neighboring countries, even though they are so different in terms of economic development.
Yeah. So reading the chapter, I was struck by how comparable some of the data that is collected actually is, especially considering that to do this cross-border research, you need a lower level of aggregation, than the country or state level. But I do not, my research is not in this area. So I think some significant challenges appear once you actually start working with this data, right? And realize, maybe we cannot make these comparisons. And I guess part of the problem may be because the data is usually collected for purposes other than studying the border. And so I'm wondering, what are some of the things you would like to see, or some of the recommendations for how to have better data and create better data sources to be able to study this region?
I can say a couple of words about that, but I think before I do, the comparability, I think, is due to the fact that most countries in the world model their data collection program on the guidelines set forth by the United Nations Statistics Division. So there is, it's not the case that the U.S. just does its own thing and every other country does its own thing. There are some standardizations, and there are certain types of data programs that countries have that most countries have. So everybody has a census of population and housing. Almost everybody has an economic census, and what you look at there is partly determined by the specifics in the country, but it's also partly in response to guidelines and standards that the United Nations Statistics Division has suggested, has recommended as good practice. So this does lead to a certain degree of comparability between the U.S. and Mexico. And I don't know if Eduardo agrees with me, but I think INEGI is really good. I think what they do is super professional. And I just want to say that because there is this tendency to think, Mexico, it's not really as sophisticated or professional as the U.S., et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not true. That's not true. These people at INEGI do a really professional job. And, they are working in a different set of circumstances than in the U.S. But I think what they do provide is quite good. And they're also very responsive. If you call them and talk to them, they are very helpful in terms of helping you find things. So with that, Eduardo, you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you think that we need?
I mean, what you say is true. I mean, INEGI is it's a good institution with good workers, statisticians, and is well managed. And the critique would be more like in terms of the lack of information, the lack of funding to do more projects and more things that could be done, right? Like I was talking about trade. I would like to have some kind of coordination for trade, because we need to know exactly what's going on between the trade, the U.S. and Mexico, not to mention Canada, right? So that would be, for me, something that I've been confronting problems with that. And so I would like to have that kind of stuff, improved. Yeah. And, I guess that has to do with coordination at some level, and funding, particularly in the case of Mexico. So in Mexico, what they do is okay, it's good, but it's insufficient, let's say. And in some cases, for United States is sort of the same at lower level, right? I mean, trade would be an area, and surveys, right? Like the income and expenditure survey, which is not quite representative at the state level. Not all the states are representative, and that should be improved too, so we can have data for the state of Baja California, the border states. All of the states should be representative.
I think if you could take just about any area of activity, that if you just think about What do you do during the day? What's your, you go to work, you go to school. Those are areas where we need data, right? And we don't have it. So, just to give you some more examples. I mean, we talked about workers. Eduardo's talked about trade. He also has talked a little bit about foreign direct investment. But, how many families are there along the border which are separated by the border, either willingly, because some people may choose to live on one side or the other, or unwillingly? Because one of the main reasons people cross is to visit family. So, but how big a force is that? How powerful a force is that? How many people are living on the other side of the border nearby where you could visit them? We don't know. We don't know that. What about healthcare? This is a whole big area where Mexico has now been providing a lot of services to Americans or people resident in the U.S., many of them U.S. citizens. What are usage rates like for healthcare? I mean, how often there's a lot of investment. You've probably seen it in the Texas border region and certainly in the California border region. There's investment in healthcare facilities on the Mexican side because it solves a problem. This is a way of the interaction and the complementarities of our economies work, is that healthcare is enormously expensive in the U.S. If you can obtain high quality care in Mexico, people will cross the border. Mexican entrepreneurs know that. And so they're building hospitals and other types of medical facilities, senior care facilities, that sort of thing. It's a growth business in Mexico. But how big a phenomenon is this? How easy, hard, frequent is it to use your U.S.-based insurance in Mexico? I mean, some insurance providers will pay for services in Mexico, but how does that work? That would be interesting to know. We talked about education a little bit. We don't have good statistics about students going back and forth. What are the characteristics of those students? We don't really know. So there's you can think about, in the San Diego, Tijuana area, for example, there's a lot of, may not seem important, but I think it is. There's a lot of artist collectives, of artists that work together. And it's like not clear, are these people Mexican or American? They're both, and they're sometimes showing in Tijuana and sometimes showing in San Diego or Los Angeles. And, there's philanthropy, there's social activism, there's every area sort of human activity. We're missing statistics, that we would like to have.
It sounds to me like this is a lot about what I mentioned of like existing data is collected for a variety of purposes, and studying the border, it doesn't seem to be one of those things, right? And so once you focus on the things that happen at the border, you realize there's all of this data efforts that that could be taken or done, but but definitely a lot of important questions to understand the border region that we could answer.
Yeah.
Well, James Gerber, Professor Emeritus of Economics at San Diego State University, and Eduardo Mendoza, Professor in the Department of Economic Studies, El Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Thank you so much for answering these questions and for this conversation.
Thank you, Enrique.
Thank you, Enrique.
That was James Gerber and Eduardo Mendoza. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to the Judy Lay Allen Mexico Center podcast. Thanks to Lisa Huacata, our program manager, and Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Special thanks to Judy Lay Allen for her generous support of the work we do at the center. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host and do not necessarily reflect those of the center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at usmexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, and Spotify. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. From a fully vaccinated Enrique Quesada, stay safe, get your vaccine, wear a mask, and I will see you next time.